Um, hello. Hello, thank you all for coming to this early afternoon session by Joe Brockmeier. I'd like to thank you all, thank our speaker for being here. I would also like to thank our sponsors for this room, Q, which is an IT and digital talent firm in LA, focused on finding local technology talent for our clients through deep involvement in the so-called tech community. Please feel free to contact them either through their website at qconnects.com or look for them around here. So today, Joe, who is cloud person at Red Hat, will talk to us. No, he's not a cloud person. I am so sorry. His magic. Yes, as he prefers to introduce himself and his work during the first slide, so I am leaving it at that. It sounds more mysterious that way. So we are going to talk about solving the package problem, which I'm sure it was here. We've come a long, long way since the days of installing software by compiling source and shoving it into a system with make install. Last year, Docker containers were heralded as a way out of the complexities of managing software. But today, we're faced with a slew of container offerings and things look more complex than ever. So what's the solution? Let us welcome Joe to solve our problem.
I don't think it. Thank you. There are no solutions here. There, yeah, international man of mystery, maybe. I don't know. Anyway, one of the things I want to do is encourage people to, if most of y'all have your laptops or mobile devices out, so I would like to encourage you to use them for good and actually tweet about the presentation, assuming you are all on the Tweeters or Facebooks or the Google Pluses or whatever. I am JZB on the Twitters. My project is Project Atomic. So I would love it if you guys were to tweet about the presentation during the presentation, and of course, talk up Scale in general, because they do a wonderful job every year, and it'd be great to see spreading the word over social media about it. So, who is this guy? My title bears about as much relationship to what I do these days as international man of mystery, really. I work mostly on Project Atomic. How many people have heard of Project Atomic? Okay, how many people know what that is? Fewer hands. Okay, so I will explain that a little bit during the presentation. I work for Red Hat. Some of you may remember me from previous careers, such as OpenSUSE Community Manager. I worked for Citrix for a year, working on Apache Cloud Stack. I'm a member of the Apache Software Foundation, and I am a recovering tech journalist. So spent many, many years writing for basically any magazine or website with Linux in the name that actually paid for you to do such things. And many of my friends, you may remember my byline, many of my friends call me Zonker. So that's who I am. I work for Red Hat these days, and I do almost full-time these days on Project Atomic. I'm in the open source and standards group there. What I want to talk about today, I've been using Linux for a very, very long time. I started using Linux in 1996, started using Slackware, which was not renowned then or really now for its package management capabilities. It's renowned for many, many things, and Patrick is a wonderful human being, and Slackware is still an awesome distribution for the problem set that it takes on. But package management is not really that problem. So how many of you remember doing the make install dance with source code? Okay, so I think we are all agreed that things are better than they used to be, but they're still not perfect. So what I want to talk about today is the packaging problem we have right now. Then I want to talk a little bit about 3 potential solutions to different parts of that problem, which are software collections, rpm-ostree, and Linux containers. Presentation used to say Docker, but really Docker is just one of the better ways of handling Linux containers. So I'm not sure that Docker is the lock on being the future solution for containers. It's just right now the front runner. Bless you. Or as my friend who is not a religious person says, science, whenever somebody, you get weird looks when you do that in public. Like I've gotten in the habit in my circle of friends when someone sneezes just saying, science, and everybody understands. And then you do that on an airplane and you're like, what? Let's all make a pact to start doing that. Let's make a trend, like just when somebody sneezes, everybody just say, science! Next year, it'll be a thing. All right. Finally, after I talk about these potential solutions, I want to talk about some of the pitfalls, because one of the things I've noticed in this industry is a new technology comes along, and we all love the new shiny, right? We love new things, and we want to embrace them, and we don't necessarily consider all of the things we had learned previously for the old solutions. And I've noticed this particularly with Docker. People have sort of forgotten some of the lessons we have learned with Debian and RPM packages and some of the lessons we've learned about security. And I'm going to talk about that. How many people have heard Dan Walsh talk about Docker security? Just one person? Okay, well, some of this will be new to some of y'all. And finally, we'll end with some questions if you have them. And if you don't, I'll ask the audience questions because I have lots. So in the beginning, we had, basically people installing from source code. We had tarballs precompiled, and, things were neat because we had open source and we could distribute the source to applications, and that was good. And then we realized that was good, but it wasn't going far enough. And so we started to see Linux distributions as sort of the center of the open source universe. If your particular project was not packaged in the major distributions, you were at a strong disadvantage. Like if you were a member of the Postgres team, you really wanted to make sure that Ubuntu or Debian or OpenSUSE or whatever the popular distribution of the day was, had your stuff prepackaged because people didn't want to compile it from source, okay? And so that was good for a while. The pace of distribution development and the pace of application development were kind of in sync for a brief period of time, okay? And then we even started having the things like the cadence of 6-month development cycles and 6-month release cycles with distributions, and that was good. But the problem was that didn't move at the right pace for a lot of applications. And we all know, how many folks are developers? All right, how many folks are sysadmins? Do we have any accountants in the audience? Okay. I always like to just check. All right. So developers usually don't want to be limited to the system version of the software, okay? You don't want to be limited to the version of PHP or Ruby or the Ruby gems that ship or whatever. You usually want the latest and greatest thing for your application. Everything else, however, the admins want to stay the same, right? Because you don't want to be distributing all the new stuff. You want a stable operating system, and you may be willing to accept a little bit of flux with some libraries for the application, but the rest of it, you want to be stable. Did anybody catch Jim Perrin's talk yesterday about running applications in CentOS 5 container on CentOS 7? Yeah. There is a huge disconnect in what we want to be running on the hardware and what we want to be running in the application a lot of the time. We also have a problem that developers want easier ways to deploy complex software, okay? How many people have heard the phrase, well, it worked on my laptop, okay? We all know that there is a disconnect between what's in production and what's on the developer's laptop. And we usually discover this, hopefully, in a test dev environment and not actually in production, right? We really hope that we don't discover when we're switching from, the application that's known good to the new version of the application that, oh, this library foo is an old version and it breaks the application and suddenly all of my customers can't get to my site or whatever, business you happen to be in. We also want to automate all of the things. There are some what I like to call unicorn companies out there like Netflix that are showing us how awesome you can develop and deploy software, who are doing, they talk about doing multiple deploys a day. How many people are in an environment where you can actually deploy multiple things, not in a week, but actually per day? Okay, not a lot. How many people want to be in that environment where you can, just deploy something straight into production? You don't want to be in that environment. Okay, you don't have to be Bill. It's okay. Bill is an admin. Bill fears that. Yes. And you are right to do so, right? As an admin, you are right to fear change. And that also gets into our packaging problem, because half of the audience for packaging are the developers, and half of the audience, the consumers, are the admins. And they both have a different rhythm of working, and they both have different, we all have the same goal in the end. It's not to get fired. And that depends on, actually keeping things up and actually meeting the business goals and all of those things. How many people have read Gene Kim's book on DevOps? Just a couple of people? The Phoenix Project? There need to be more hands up, okay? Homework for the audience. Yes, as a speaker for Scale, I am fully empowered to give you homework. I bet you didn't know that. No, if you have not read Gene Kim's book, The Phoenix Project, you really need to go out and buy that. It's a quick read, and it's actually not your typical boring business book. It's actually sort of a novelized version of a business embracing DevOps. It's not exactly John Irving. I mean, this is not like, going to win a Pulitzer or any literary awards, but it is a fast, decent read, and it teaches the concepts well. And it walks through basically the concepts of going from the old and busted models that a lot of businesses have around IT, where all the different silos don't communicate well, where the security guys and the network guys and the developers and the admins aren't talking and working well together, into a environment where all of those things are working well together. And that's where we all want to get. And this is, a tiny bit of that is how we package and deploy software. So what I want to talk about is software collections, rpm-ostree, and Docker, but more generically containers. So first, let's talk about software collections. How many people have heard of software collections? Okay. Great concept, one of the worst names in history for a project, because literally anything can be a software collection. But what we're specifically talking about is a special type of RPM for deploying things that are not the same version of system software, that don't conflict, that let you move at a different pace than what's on your system. So let's give an example. If you're on RHEL 6 something, and you want to deploy a newer version of Python for one application, you do not want to upgrade Python for the entire box, because things will break spectacularly, right? There are many system tools that depend on Python. But your application needs a newer or older version of Python, so you don't want to be stuck with the system version. Software collections allow you to deploy newer or older versions of the software that's on your system. They are still in RPM format, okay, but they don't require any changes to RPM. So the whole concept around software collections does not require us to break RPM or do anything different. It doesn't really require anybody who's familiar with RPM to learn anything new about administering or managing them, okay? They are not just a different version of software package for your OS. And I'll give you kind of an example. The first time I did this presentation, I wanted to run it on CentOS because I wanted to demonstrate some of the software collections. Well, CentOS at the time, I was running like 6 something on my desktop, and the version of LibreOffice or OpenOffice that was on there was spectacularly old, right, compared to what I wanted. So I wanted to install a new version of OpenOffice or LibreOffice on it. And how many people have ever done that, where you basically take one version of what's installed and try to replace it, something major like OpenOffice, LibreOffice. You have to go and get rid of all that, and it usually breaks some dependencies with your desktop, and then you have to install the new stuff and probably has to force this and all that. That's not what software collections do, okay? They basically sit alongside what's already on your system. They do not overwrite any system files. They don't overwrite any of your existing configurations. They don't overwrite anything under Etsy for your existing stuff. Let me give you an example here. Let's say you want to deploy on CentOS 6.5 or 6.6, PHP 5.4, okay? Instead of the standard system PHP, you're going to pull in a package called PHP 5.4, and it will pull in a number of sub-packages that are all designed to work specifically with this software collection. And instead of living in the normal location, they live under opt. And software collections includes a couple of tools I'll talk about in a second that actually allow you to let specific applications know about that software collection. Everything else that's running on your system will be oblivious to it. So I've already talked about this a little bit. I won't beat that dead horse anymore. If you are packaging software, how many people actually package things for consumption? How many people are doing it for like more than just their organization? How many people are packaging things for the rest of the world? A couple of people, okay. If you're packaging things, it requires a couple of changes to your existing spec files. So if you wanted to do a software collection, and you could easily repackage it with just a couple of minor changes to spec files. They do not conflict with updates. So let's say I get a shell shocked for Ruby on my system. Okay, so I do an update of the software collection. That will not update the system Ruby, or vice versa. So if you're running a newer version of Ruby that is not vulnerable, but you update an older version, it's not going to change that installed version. Does that make sense? So basically, these two things move independently of one another. Software collections can depend on other SCLs. So if you have an application that's packaged as an SCL and you want to pull in MariaDB, you don't have to package that yourself. You can pull that version in. So that will save you a lot of time and trouble if you're packaging one application that has to work with two other software collections, okay? I'll run through kind of a real quick, not a demo, but just the example of how you would use them. If you were using CentOS right now, you would basically just do a couple of things to start using software collections. So if you're already on CentOS 6.5, for example, you just do a yum install CentOS-release-SCL. That will pull down, right now CentOS has these packaged, but CentOS does not have them. They don't show up by default. You basically have to tell CentOS you want this repo. So then you do a yum install, a PHP 5.4 or whatever, and then to get your application to recognize it, you'll do an SCL enable PHP 5.4 application and options. And so then when that application runs, it will see PHP 5.4 instead of the system version, but everything else will remain oblivious to it. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Yeah.
Well, how does, like, for example, if you write a set of scripts that has things at the top of them that reference, like, you would be an environment,
Yeah.
how would it know to go hit, like, Python 3 instead of, like, say, Python 2?
So the question is, if you have a definition at the top of a script or whatever, how does it know to go to this? The software collection will change the environment for you. Yeah. I'm sorry, what was that?
Does it create like a virtual type of thing, so that way
Yeah.
Everything that gets just run within that folder is recognized as traditionally the unique version?
Yeah. So I mean, it basically changes all of the environment stuff for that application, but not anything else. So does that make sense? You had a question too.
I was just going to ask, is SEO almost akin to SEO alternatives? You kind of answered it already.
Yeah.
That's environment variable.
Yeah. So it's not really super magical stuff. It's, yeah. There's a really good, Langdon White wrote a really good tutorial on using Python and Django. So that's the short URL to get to that. And you can find the current packages here for CentOS. There's also some information here on how to do your own packaging if you would like to participate in software collections. If you are doing your own packaging, there's a nice handy tool, spec to SCL, that will actually try to do the right thing with your spec file to convert it for compiling a software collection. And then there is another set of instructions on packaging SCLs there. There is an upstream for software collections that we have been working on for about the last year called softwarecollections.org. Brilliant naming, right? So that's softwarecollections.org/en. There is a CentOS SIG. That's kind of, CentOS is where most of the action is happening right now. We are trying to get a healthy upstream going where even the stuff that will eventually turn into a RHEL-supported product is actually developed upstream first, tested and everything, and then pulled back into RHEL instead of the way it's been initially, which was developed mostly for RHEL and then some components pushed out. You can already see the Git repos here, and here's the mailing list. We have not yet, basically they're in process of building things in Koji or in the CentOS build system. We have not reached the point of actually pulling them in and signing them with the CentOS keys and so forth, but that should be happening pretty soon. And if you have any detailed questions about the CentOS SIGs, Jim Perrin and Johnny Hughes are both here this weekend, and they're mostly at the Red Hat booth. So if you have any questions around that, both of those folks can answer any detailed questions. Or sort of a tangent, if you have anything of interest for a CentOS SIG and would like to start one, they would be happy to talk to you about that. And is everybody familiar with CentOS SIGs, or should I explain those real briefly? Okay. Real briefly, the CentOS special interest groups are to do add-ons to CentOS. So, for example, Project Atomic is actually a SIG for CentOS, producing an atomic host based on CentOS. We have a cloud SIG that is busy packaging Zen for CentOS and things like that, packaging, OpenStack, RDO for CentOS, stuff like that. Any questions on that? So I already talked a little bit about this, but basically the upstream community has all the resources that you would need for building and managing collections. So what the point of all this is basically we realize that the base OS and some of the application stuff need to move at different speeds. So software collections currently are around, providing support for newer software on older releases. So, Ruby on Rails on CentOS 6, or Node on CentOS, which is, not something that was originally around when RHEL 6 was released. OpenShift is leveraging SCLs for some of its cartridges. We're going to be using them in Docker containers. Probably one thing, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in the containers part, but one thing people may not have picked up on is that CentOS is starting to release containers for not just the standard CentOS 6 and 7 containers, but also things like Nginx, Python, MariaDB, basically containers that are based on specific pieces of software that people might want to build other apps on, so you don't have to worry about maintaining those, okay? And we're going to be using a lot of software collections to provide containers around specific versions of languages and things like that. So let's switch gears a little bit, and I want to talk about rpm-ostree. rpm-ostree is a technology we're using for Project Atomic to provide atomic updates, meaning updates that are basically one operation that can be rolled back. So right now, when you do an update to a box like CentOS box, you get a bunch of RPMs or RPM deltas and you apply them against the system. Maybe you have to reboot. But basically, you get this bunch of operations where one thing may break something in your application or your network or whatever, okay? How many people have fought with dpackage or RPM to roll back something that has been upgraded? How many people have enjoyed that? Okay. It's, you enjoy that. Okay, well, all right. I'm sorry? You also enjoy the dentist. Okay. If you put that on a resume, that's actually a desirable thing, right? It's like, yeah, give it Bob. He enjoys that. Hey, it's good to have people like that. But most of us don't enjoy that. I certainly don't enjoy, for example, being on the road for 2 weeks and doing an update to my laptop and realizing that I've just broken the network, and to fix it, I need network. rpm-ostree, however, lets you basically do an update, one operation. As long as it succeeds, you can reboot, get into your new environment, and if it's broken, you just do, atomic rollback, and you go to the previous known good version of the system. Colin basically developed this as the easiest way to say it is Git for operating systems. It started as GNOME Continuous. Does anybody remember that? Back in the day, many years ago, when GNOME was still and one period where GNOME was trying to encourage a lot of people to do development, they realized that compiling GNOME is not really fun. And, for developers who just want to write an application against the latest version of GNOME, having to maintain their own build tree for GNOME was painful, and actually building GNOME took a while. Any other considerations aside, compiling an entire desktop takes a while, right? So they wanted a way where people could easily switch back and forth between their productive desktop and the test environment where they could actually see if their application worked against the latest GNOME. So he worked on GNOME Continuous and created what's called OSTree. OSTree basically is, as I said, kind of a Git for operating system. It doesn't actually use Git, but it's a similar concept of having a tree with checkouts and everything where you can, you just get a continuous stream of hashes. You can roll back and forth in the history. And you can create, with rpm-ostree, you can create an installable tree from RPMs. So you don't lose all of the stuff, like when he went to Fedora and said, hey, we should do this for Atomic, we didn't have to start packaging software in a completely new and different way. We already had all of those packages. We just had to run them through a tool that would create a different tree instead of the standard installed images that we used. rpm-ostree is not a package manager. It doesn't do a lot of the things that Yum or DNF do, or Zipper, or whatever you happen to use. But it does a couple of the functions in terms of providing updates. Okay? So you can actually have, yeah. It's completely different. I mean, it's basically Yum. I've never actually used Yum downgrade. So rpm-ostree is going to basically switch you back from the current tree into the previous known good version. It's going to just give you the entire tree as it was before you changed. Does that make sense? It's similar to what some mobile companies are doing right now, the way they have an A and B, where you basically switch from, when you do your mobile update, you just switch from the version that's installed to the one you just downloaded. So does that make sense? So not only can you switch between like Fedora version blah 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 to Fedora +1, you actually can, using rpm-ostree, maintain different trees on your system where you could switch between, say, Fedora 21 and Fedora Rawhide, or if you wanted to get really exotic, between Fedora 21 and CentOS 7 trees. So you can actually maintain not just different versions of that distribution, but different distributions altogether if they're using rpm-ostree. Currently, it's an immutable system. Here's another difference. Basically, when you roll out a tree, you don't update it with a package. So, for example, if you get an atomic image, you don't install a new package on that. You have to roll a new tree with that package and then update to that. Okay? Any questions about that? Yes, sir. I'm sorry? Not currently, no. The question was for the camera, if they are recording this, is there a way to do it without rebooting? And the answer is no. That is, if you're using it on a desktop or a system like that, that's a bit of a downside. But the way that it's envisioned using is sort of like in a, cluster environment or an environment where you're running a bunch of systems, and you're kind of following like the Netflix immutable system model, where basically you're not going to update things in place. You're just going to roll out new images. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other questions? Sometimes it's hard to tell if people are stretching or actually trying to ask a question, So then the last bit that I want to talk about is DACA, as Dan Walsh would say. I'm assuming everyone in here has heard of Docker. Is there anybody who has escaped it so far? Is there like one guy in the back is like, yeah, I've never heard of it? No. Fun fact, a lot of my friends are parents. And following them on Facebook, I keep seeing people talking about how annoyed they are with this song from the movie Frozen. I've never heard it. I have managed to go like a couple of years now without ever hearing this song. And like I hear all these people who are just full of rage about, or whatever about this song. I'm like, I've never heard it, and I'm going well out of my way now to avoid it. All right, so the problem with packages. When I first started using not Slackware, I really enjoyed being able to deploy things from dpackage or RPM and then ultimately apt or yum. It was great being able to just type, yum install blah and getting all of the dependencies and everything. That was magical foo when I was, using Linux back in 99 or 2000 or whenever they started getting all this stuff. And but it's not really good for deploying really complex applications. Like if you can install WordPress, which is not a terribly complex application, but you can install WordPress from a package, but you still have to do all the manual setup. You still have to set up the database and other things. RPM packaging doesn't really help you with those things. Debian doesn't help you with those things. It's not very portable. An application that is written for CentOS 6 is not going to easily run on 7. Packaging guidelines for things like Fedora and Debian can be very, very frustrating. Has anybody ever tried to read through the packaging guidelines for Fedora? This gets really complex. And there are a lot of people who have been turned off trying to package things for distributions because the packaging guidelines, for example, Java and RPM packaging do not play well together, okay? Packaging Ruby gems and things like that have their own, package distribution models, those don't play well with RPM and Debian packages. Packages don't provide a solution for running containerized apps, okay? And when I say containerized applications, I'm talking about the concept of running microservices where each container just does one specific thing. Packages don't provide a solution for doing that. So Docker came along and everybody was like, this is awesome because we can basically create a container with our application and ship it, and people just run it, and it looks like in production just like it looked like on my laptop, right? You can do versioning and fun things like that with a container. You can reuse components. We had a guy come from Yahoo to the Flock conference in Prague last year, and he talked about how they're basically doing one container as a base OS, another container layers Apache on top of that, another container team then layers their application on top of Apache in the base OS. So the team that's doing the application does not have to worry about any of the underlying stuff except their application and what's necessary for it. The Apache team deals with all the optimizations and packaging of Apache. The base OS team worries about all of that stuff, and everybody is happy. Any questions on that? Anybody have any doubts about Docker at this point, or Linux containers? Is everybody pretty much drank the Kool-Aid on containers? Nobody's raising a hand, like just uncomfortable laughter. What's that? What's that? Okay. So we kind of see Docker as sort of a solution to a lot of these things. And Red Hat is not an exception to this. We have kind of jumped on the container bandwagon. We are putting a lot of resources into it. We see a lot of, really useful things here. But there are a couple of pitfalls that people need to be aware of, and things, poor practices that we are seeing being put in place. There's a couple of really good articles, and I think even a video out there from Dan Walsh called "Containers Don't Contain." There are ways, if you have root in a container, you can get root on the system. You can do things, for example, there is still an open bug about the kernel key ring, where if you're in a container and you can see and update the kernel key ring, and another container can see and update the kernel key ring, you can actually read another container's keys, which is a bad thing, right? Signing, I think Docker is just starting to implement signing. How many people have downloaded it, done a Docker pull from anything from the Docker Hub? Okay, is anybody running any of that in production? Or anywhere where you would have sensitive data? Okay, you do realize that there's absolutely zero assurance right now. When you do a Docker pull Fedora, for example, there is zero real assurance that that actually came from Fedora. There's no signing or anything to prove that that actually is a Fedora image and that there's no malware in there, it's untampered with, and everything else. And there are also people who are pulling things that aren't even, not even from the official repositories, air quotes, from like Debian or Fedora or whatever. They're just pulling something because somebody has packaged a Docker application. You're raising a hand back there, John? Yes, I was getting to that. Yeah, I was getting to that. Yeah, if you can still manually import, export containers. So like if you are, I'm going to use sensible as opposed to paranoid, but if you really care about where it came from, you can get images directly from the source. So if you want to use Fedora or CentOS, there are places where you can download them directly. Yeah. Yeah. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Yeah. Yeah. So John's point, and I don't disagree with this, John's point was this is a similar thing we went through with Chef a couple of years ago where you would pull a cookbook and it wasn't signed, you didn't know the provenance of that with absolute certainty. We went through this with packages, before we had package signing. And so that kind of gets back to the point that I had at the beginning of the talk, which was basically we're relearning all of this stuff. Docker, I think, was something that took off a lot faster than they expected it to. And they didn't have all the components in place, and they are trying to address a number of concerns all at once. Okay? So don't take this is not don't use Docker. This is more of there is a lot of work yet to do, and we should all approach it with that mindset. So I'm enthusiastic about using containers and getting them ready for production. There are also people who are all, they want to bash on Docker and call it a lot of hype. But, I still remember the days of Linux when SMP was coming, okay? And we got there, right? We can handle multiprocessor now, right? We can handle NUMA. We can handle thousands of systems. And there were people who were shouting about, well, you're never going to be able to do this. Solaris can do this, but this isn't ready for production. We'll get there. It's open source, and we will make it work. I just want to make sure that people consider these things before rolling them out. Another thing that's not really well understood yet is packaging apps. I did a talk at LinuxCon EU last year, and somebody, I wish I had been recording the audience because it was great. I was talking about like all the great things about packaging stuff in containers, and somebody raised their hand. And they're like, yeah, but couldn't you like package something really, really badly in a container? I'm like, yes, you can. People are shipping containers where everything is in one container. Database and memcache and this, that, everything in one container. It's ugly. It's terrible. But then again, there are people shipping terrible, ugly RPMs and Debian packages too. The technology is there to be used. You can write really elegant Perl, right? And you can also have these one-liners from hell that no one in their right mind will ever be able to debug. I'm not sure if you're laughing because you've seen them or you've written them. Okay. So anyway, and deploying apps into production is still not a well-understood problem, and most of the tools are still evolving like crazy. I mean, Kubernetes looks to be one of the best ways to orchestrate containers, and Google and Red Hat and even Microsoft have kind of aligned behind it. But it's not mature yet. It's not 100% ready. So there is a lot of things that we need to do before it's 100% ready. Some other problems, auditing software in containers. Along with citing, auditing software right now is very hard. Updates to containers, okay? We don't have good tools. If you have a bunch of containers running on your system, we don't have a bunch of good tools for managing updates to those when there is a security release. We have great tools for updating the host OS, but we don't have great tools for updating containers and automating that yet. Host container mismatches. Fedora 23 is going to switch to GCC 5, I believe. And I've had a couple of conversations with folks on the team. The concept with Docker is that, you can run an Ubuntu container on RHEL. You can run a RHEL container on Ubuntu or Debian. You can run Slackware, okay, on Ubuntu or, and I have. But you can actually come into corner cases where, because you're running, for example, an Ubuntu or a CentOS container on Ubuntu, and it expects SE Linux on the host, things go badly, okay? So you can run into mismatches between host and container where you run into bugs that you wouldn't see in other circumstances. And I thought I would put a line here. Anybody who's playing with Docker seriously, I'm curious if people have seen something that I've missed here. Any problems or pitfalls that people have run into that I haven't covered? With packaging applications, yeah, for containers. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, so his comment was you can use Docker not just for applications but as a platform for builds and so forth, which it is helpful for that, yeah. Let's go to the very back of the room first. Yeah. Yeah. Right. The question is, when are we going to fix that every container needs to be rebuilt? I don't know. My crystal ball on that one's a little foggy. I do know that that is a problem that needs to be addressed, but it's even a problem that hasn't been well recognized. I noticed, I forget if it was shell-shocked or what. Does everybody remember when they announced Docker Library? It was like either the day before or after Heartbleed, and they kind of had to be poked into updating all of the library containers they had just released to make sure they were not vulnerable to that. So they were out announcing, saying, everybody go download this. And they were still, all of those containers were vulnerable. you know, and they didn't have any good system for telling people about any CVEs in the containers or anything. So, what's up, John? John was commenting you also had to do that with a bunch of Amazon. It's not a new problem, but I think people understand it in one context and they forget about it in the other. Because I think people think about containers somewhere between a package and an OS. You know, there was another question. Hold on, there was another question there. Yeah. Yeah. Uh huh. Okay. Oh, well, yeah. Hand him the microphone. I did not know that existed. Now he's shy. He's like, I don't want to talk into the microphone.
I just said it all. So,
well, either you can repeat it or I can. You probably know what you wanted to say better than
I
me.
was just saying, Docker and Docker doesn't run very well. It's not.
Yeah.
It hasn't. It's not a supported mode of operation. And second was ulimit is not exposed in the container. So if you need a lot of file handles, you don't get it.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's a gentleman over here. Thank you for running the mic around. And how much time do I have left?
Earlier you were talking about layering Docker containers with you have the base OS and the Apache. Couldn't you solve the issue that he was talking about where you have shell shock, you have to rebuild all the containers by just having the bash or SSL, OpenSSL as a container? Sorry, as like an overlay?
Well, but you would have to know. So the question, you would have to know which components are going to be vulnerable. Yeah, I don't know that would work well in practice. It's innovative thinking, but I don't know that would work well in practice. Other questions? Back there, that gentleman.
Have you possibly heard about the Nix project, the Nix package manager? So the OSTree was also a GNOME project which was based on the ideas from the Nix package manager. And Elko Dostra wrote a PhD paper on how our package managers don't work that good. It's like 100-page PhD, which is really nice written, and that's like that was the basis for the OSTree. It's like all the mutable part and so on.
So yeah, like I keep getting people commenting about Nix OS or whatever about once every 3 times I talk about rpm-ostree. The problem with that was it would require a retooling from start to finish for basically all of the build systems that we're doing, for example. And that's not even taking into account, for example, any deficiencies it may have on its own. So it's unlikely that Nix package manager is going to be adopted by, let's say, Fedora. It just is very
full
unlikely.
in, or it's a full stack solution, so you have to go all in.
Yeah, and that's unlikely.
Right.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
A comment and a question.
Okay. I didn't say comments.
Oh, okay. So I've been playing around with systemd nspawn. It's kind of a separate idea.
Yeah.
Of booting a bootable ch root and not in the same way that we're used to as in ch root. And there's problems with that. Like any systemd distro in theory should be able to boot correctly, but I haven't had that experience. So the second thing is that I haven't really drinking the Kool-Aid for using everything as a separate container. I've been looking into using OverlayFS or AUFS or one of the other virtual file systems to lay on top of my file system.
Mm-hmm.
Has there been any work on getting OSTree or a similar project to work with that? Because I want to be able to not have to reboot my system or have everything stuck in a container.
Right.
To just be able to overlay and then the entire tree, the differences of the tree, and then remove that if I want.
So the question, well, never mind. I'm sorry. I got into the habit of repeating questions, and now they've got the microphone. It's messing with me. First, I enjoyed your use of the term "drinking the Kool-Aid," and then, so basically, yeah, it's on the roadmap to do overlay packages somewhere. Colin has done a couple of proof of concepts. Colin Walters is the guy who came up with rpm-ostree and all that stuff. And it is on the roadmap somewhere to be able to do overlay packages. There are a number of challenges the way that he initially designed rpm-ostree, where he has to figure out where they're going to live on the file system and where they can put data and some other things. So it is likely maybe in the Fedora 23 time frame. I don't want to put words in Colin's mouth, but that we might see the ability to install some things, but not like you might be able to install Apache as a RPM overlay, but not say glibc or something like that. So it's probably going to be like an integrated thing. John? Hmm. Okay.
That's the same pattern we're advising people to. Instead of telling people to go from scratch for their minimalist containers, we're telling people to do from BusyBox.
Do it from BusyBox? Okay.
Because that way when stuff goes wrong, you have a shell.
All right. Let's hang on for the microphone here. There's a guy up here. Sorry. I think maybe like two more questions because I'm about out of time, I believe.
So we've been using software collections for a couple of years now. We're a Perl shop, and when we started, CentOS 5 had like Perl 5.8, and that's ancient in Perl history.
Yeah.
So we've been using the software collections to run the newer versions of Perl, and I'm wondering, we've been looking at Docker and other container technologies. Would we, if we wanted to deploy containers to deploy our applications with the newer versions of Perl, like on CentOS 6 or CentOS 7, would we continue using software collections within the container paradigm, or would we deploy containers some other way?
Oh, that's a good question. You could do this in a couple of ways. You could use software collections, or you could just, update Perl however you wanted to do. Like you could take, as long as you're running CentOS that will run a container, as long as you're running 6 or 7, you could, do 7 and not install Perl and then install Perl from upstream, do it yourself, however you want to do it. How we would recommend doing it would probably be to use a software collection if you wanted a non-stream. But it kind of depends on what your shop prefers to do. So we'll work with you kind of either way on that. So other questions? Okay. Well, thanks very much, folks. Anyway, there's where you can get more information about Project Atomic, where we're kind of doing a lot of this work. And if you want to get in touch with me, just JZB at Red Hat. Thank you.
Thank you. Before you leave, if you remember to go either to your app or to the Scale website for the survey and the talk feedback. Thank you.
Say nice things.